Hi, I'm Jim Knotts, President and CEO of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. Welcome to today's virtual reading of the names. 2022 marks the 40th anniversary of the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. As part of our commemoration, we'll host an in-person reading of the names at the wall from November 7th through 10th, 2022, when all 58,281 names on the wall will be read aloud. In the lead up to that event, we'll be reading names each day online while sharing the photos of these heroes. For our daily virtual reading, the names of the service members will be read by month and day of death between the years 1956 and 1975 in alphabetical order for the given day. We apologize in advance for any mispronunciations. Know that our readers are doing their best to honor these service members. We hope you'll listen and watch each day and share with others as we remember and honor those who gave their lives during the Vietnam War.
John Benjamin Abetamarco, Joseph Adams, Rex Charles Allred, Michael John Amato, John Austin Anderson, Scott Frederick Anderson, Ronald Michael Antwine, Carl Francis Abergast Jr., Dean Edward Armstrong, Daniel Raymond Arnold, John Manuel Avila, Alan Roy Barnes, Charles A. Bazzanotti, Odell Daniel Beasley, James Douglas Bedgood, Evans Benbow Jr., Bruce Carlton Besser, Patrick Wallace Best, Jimmy Ray Bice, Jimmy P. Black, Ralph Roland Black, James Lee Blanton Jr., Michael Delano Blia, Jerry Charles Bach, Peter Quirinus Boats Jr., David Christopher Boré, Kilburn Dean Boudra, Thomas Massey Boyd III, Oscar Dan Boydston, Sherman C. Brady, Sammy L. Brewer, Olis Brewster, Francis Peter Brickmont Jr., Randy K. Bronson, John Henry Ralph Brooks, Galen Charles Brown, David Leroy Brunson, Michael Frank Buckley, David Frederick Bukowski, Robert Edward Burns, Glenn George Burt, Fernando Caballero Figueroa, Richard Bruce Caldwell Jr., Fernando Cale Zuluaga, John Edward Cashley, Joseph Cavarocci, Edward Allen Clark, Stephen Codrington, John Wesley Coghill, George Coleman, Ralph Raymond Collins Jr., Bobby G. Collins, Thomas Michael Connell, Samuel Gerald Connolly, Andrew Jones Cooper, David Lawrence Cooper, Donald June Corbett, Melvin Glenn Cormier, Moses James Cousin, Gary Lee Cox, Gerald A. Coyle, William Morris Cozad, Kenneth T. Cruz Jr., Albert Eugene Dahl,
Martin Leo Damatio, Roger Joseph Dana, James Allen Davis, Randy Mayo Davis, Glenn Philip Davis, James Albert Davis, Thomas Warren Davis, Arthur Leroy Davis, Leland Samuel Deeds, Edward John Delicott Jr., Dan Michael Dennis, Richard Gill DeCillier, Raymond James DeSanti, William Clint Dickerson, Carlos Dominguez, Michael John Dominkovitz, James Robert Dunkel, Thomas D. Dwyer, James Herbert Dye, Lawrence Nathaniel Edmonds, William Gary Eggenberger, Jaime Esquivel, Michael David Estock, Russell Irwin Evans, Douglas George Factora, Danny Wayne Fan, David Ashby Farrow, Danny Fitch, Paul Edward Fitzgibbons, John Vincent Folger, Bob W. Ford, Thomas Eugene Foster, Amos Lee Franklin, Moulton Lamar Freeman, Gerald W. Fritz, Lawrence E. Froelich, David Adame Garcia, Marion Laura Gardner, William Lawrence Garrison, Gary Joseph Geelan, Jackie D. Glenn, James Rayford Gohagan, Felix G. Gonzalez Jr., Paul Venon Goodwin, Paul Edward Goonan Jr., Ernest Lee Gordon, Jerry Edward Gorney, Asa Parker Gray Jr., Gary James Greiner, Alvin Jimmy Grimes, Robert Ayers Gruen, Jeffrey William Hurl, Tommy Wayne Haley, Darrell L. Hamlin, Gregory L. Hankemer, Tommy Lee Hankison, William Dennis Hanson, Robert Cuthbert Hardwick, James Cecil Harper Jr., William Lyle Hayden, Larry Keith Hebner, Wayne Howard Hedeman, Andrew L. Hyder, John Lewis Hendon,
Richard Arthur Henke, James Donald Hess, Burl Denton Hewitt, David A. Hicks, Cleburne William Hill Jr., Kenneth Lewis Hurst Jr., Paul Richard Hogue Jr., Robert Gene Hoop, Fred Lee Hottinger, Leroy Charles Howe, Dennis Leroy Hubbard, Eric James Huberth, David Irvin Hubner, Richard David Humphrey, Faliagafala Ilaoa, Garland Dwayne Jackson, Abraham Jackson, Bobby James, Sidney Wade Jarrell, Vincent Earl Jenkins, Raymond Arthur Jinks, Ernest Lee Johns, Eric Bernard Johnson, Jimmy Earl Johnson, Freddie Lee Jones, Larry Paul Jones, Willis George Jones, James Julius Julian Jr., Michael Joseph Juno, James G. Kays, Richard Robert Kelly, Joel Ray Kelly, Homer Philip Kendrick, Harry William Kirkstra, Anthony Wayne Key, Ray Marshall Kidd, Byron Alec Keeley, Paul J. Kingery, Randy Jean Kittleson, Carl Raymond Canopa, Donald Ray Kraft, Paul Henry Kriegel, Michael D. Lane, Alan Lane, Bobby Jean Lawrence, Stephen Michael Lee, Jerry Tyrus Lee, Edward Gilbert Lee, Dennis W. London, Carl Frederick Louvring, John Arthur Love, John Wayne Love, Paul Rodriguez Lozano, Jerome Kristen Lucas, Paul Roger Lukens, Ralph Joseph Linden Jr., Frank Joseph Maka, Robert Richard Malecki, Jesse Armando Malabox, Salvatore Patrick Menino, Paul Edward Matsk, James Anthony Margro, Kenneth Charles Marley, Ronald Wayne Mars,
Brent Thomas Masher, Robert Susumu Masuda, Robert P. Matias, Bruce Joseph Matta, George Dennis Matthews, Thomas W. Matthews, Jr., James Edward Mays, John P. McGonigal, Jr., Richard Dale McGovern, William R. McKelvey, George E. McMillan III, Patrick Victor McNerney, Billy J. Metter, Joseph Angel Mena, Charles J. Milbrandt, Arlen J. Miller, Charles Irvin Miller, Dana Lee Miller, Octavio Molina Rosario, Teddy Ray Moore, Ronald John Moorhead, Jean Charles Morak, Domingo Flores Morado, Julio Victor Morales, Edgar C. Moran III, Michael Raymond Munch, David Louis Munoz, Alan Arthur Munson, Gary Frederick Myers, David Robertson Nash, Tommy R. Nealis, John Charles Nelson, Earl Jeffrey Netzo, Philip Gwynn Nichols, Daniel Clement Nichols, Warren Paul Nix, Timothy Joseph Noden, Walter Mark Novak, Lawrence Robert Oliveira, Kenneth Lee Olson, William James Olson, Malicio Ortiz, Ray William Owen, Stephen Vance Parker, Richard Allen Patterson, Samuel Lee Patterson, Francis G. Patton, John Anthony Perez, Ronnie Louis Phelps, George William Pickell, William Anthony Pohl, William David Poole, Jr., Richard Frank Precor, Alexander E. Prunka, Jr., Thomas F. Przybelski, Charles Kent Purcell II, Antony Boguslaw Perwin, Paul J. Raber, Paul Lajara Ramos, Jr., John Edward Ray, Joaquim Vaz Rebello, John Reck, Larry Leroy Rasig, Daniel Philly Reistroffer,
James Derrick Reynolds, Wayne Richards, James Austin Ryder Jr., Curtis Edward Ringhofer, Robert Eugene Robinson, Michael Robert Ross, Robert W. Ross, Kevin Henry Ross, Roger Dale Ross, Bruce Lee Rothar, William Ardy Rush, Thomas Wayne Sadler, Robert Earl Somella, Vidal Sanchez Jr., Charles H. Sandberg, Nelson Santiago Aponte, Ralph Michael Santinello, Richard Thomas Saracus, David John Sherabone, Richard Albert Schmitz, Christopher Joseph Schramm, Mike John Scott, Gordon Allen Shaw, Frederick Wayne Sheffield, William F. Silver Jr., John Harrison Simpson, Ivan Ray Smith, Michael Ray Smith, Raymond Joseph Sousa, Francis Louis Sousa, Louis Paul Spensko, William Val Springfield, Armand Joseph Stein Jr., Wesley Warren Stevens, Gary Lynn Stevens, Michael Edward Stewart, Harold Alvin Stone, Jeffrey Charles Stowe, Edward Eugene Stroud, Ira Jackie Sturgeon, Stanley Joseph Sukawati, Robert Randolph Summers, Lynn Curtis Swanson, Thomas Nickel Teague, Samuel Charles Tharp, James Michael Thompson, Stephen Michael Thompson, Albert C. Thompson, Joseph Thomas Tiefenholler, Marvin George Tozer, Alan Robert Trent, Charles A. Urdialis Jr., Dan Page Vanoy, Wilburn Fred Vaunt, Theodore R. Vivalacqua, Dixie D. Wallace, James Harrell Waller, James Reese Walters, Frederick F. Walters, James Robert Waltz, Alan Curtis Ward, Sylvester Washington, John Weisbrod, Robert Edward Welsh,
Robert P. Weldon, Terry Arthur Winder, Miles Dalen Westman, Donald Richard White, Lynn J. Weisner, Alvin Eugene Wiles, Thomas J. Wiley, Raymond Leroy Williams, Ronald Ellis Wiltsey, David Francis Winder, Kenneth Eugene Whitmer, Michael Cami Woodavrongal, John Leo Wojcicki, Hulsa D. Wolfe, Richard Dale Wood, Bobby Clyde Wood, Robert Tinsley Wood, David Allen Worthy, Van Thomas Ray, Stephen Dale Zukroff, Gary Roman Zwicka.